For nearly 30 years, the UFC has been at the forefront of the sport of mixed martial arts, putting on the most exciting fights for its dedicated fans. But the modern 2023 era of the UFC just does not feel the same, and that's an opinion that many fans hold. So, what's happened in recent years to cause this? In previous years, the UFC had many fighters you could call the face of the company. Distinct eras where one fighter was the largest draw and brought in the most money for the company. In the early 2000s it was Chuck Liddell, the perfect man to be the company star at the time, a giant man with a mohawk that only a fighter from the noughties could pull off. Massive star. Later in the 2000s and early 2010s, you had Anderson Silva changing the game and becoming a two-weight world champion whilst becoming untouchable to most he stood across from. Massive star. Going into the mid-2010s, you have John Jones, Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor all active at the same time. Ronda and Conor both peaking around 2015-2016. For a time Ronda was the biggest draw around, but Conor would go on to shoot way past her and would definitely be considered the face of that era. He basically changed promotion in MMA. His trash talking and mental games worked amazingly well, pulling everybody's eyes to him, and when he performed the way he did and with the marketing push he got, it's no wonder he became the massive star that he did. But now, we're in the 2020s. Which fighter can you point to and say, they are the star, they are the face of the UFC? From 2020 to around 2022, you could have said it was Hamzat. He had the potential to be the face of the company for the next 5, 6, 7 years, just like Conor was. He came in and had 2 fights in 10 days, won them both incredibly decisively, and cemented himself in the minds of UFC and MMA fans in September of that year, with a 17-second one-punch KO. To everyone, he was the next big thing, a star in the making. And now, as of this video, he hasn't fought in 8 months, and the hype train has made a lot of stops, and a lot of people have hopped off. Maybe you could say Israel Adesanya's the face. I love watching him fight, but he's not got the same star power. His performances as of late, excluding his last fight, have all been very meh. He doesn't have the widely appealing personality or trash talk a superstar has. So who does that leave? Who's been in the UFC for a while now that's building or has built an aura of superstardom? I can't think of anyone that has the true superstar potential. At her peak, Ronda was doing movies, wrestling in the WWE, and on talk shows while fighting for the UFC. She was a genuine star. Conor was a minor villain in the COD, for God's sake. Call of Duty, the best selling game of all time, and he was famous enough to get a role in Infinite Warfare. The documentary Netflix done on him was a viral hit, and he was on talk shows all the time as well. There isn't anyone in the UFC right now that even has the potential for this kind of success. The thing is though, is that on purpose? In 2015, the UFC signed a deal with Reebok. The dirty details of this deal included Reebok designing a uniform for all the fighters in the UFC and paying them some amount of money. Whatever they could find down the back of the couch at Reebok HQ, I could imagine. It was a great deal for the UFC, but it made the fighters even more reliant on their fight pay to make ends meet. Why is that, you may ask? Well, the Reebok deal completely stripped away the fighters' ability to get their own sponsors on their shorts or banners and just destroyed the UFC fighter apparel market. Before this deal, fighters designed and made their own clothes with brand deals or independently, and they could seek out as many big sponsors as they wanted. And believe me, these sponsors would pay very, very well. As much as he is a giant meme, Brendan Schaub was a fairly popular guy fighting on fairly big cards. There was a lot of eyes on him, and his sponsors were paying him 6 figures per fight to put their company on his gear and on his banner. fighters often got paid a lot more from sponsors than they did from the UFC, and after the Reebok deal, guys like Brendan, who made large amounts of money every fight from third party means from sponsors, went to making their base pay, which may have only been 30 to show and 30 to win, and just 10 grand from Reebok. Can you imagine working hard for a company for years? They're paying you okay money, but you've got a great side hustle going, making you a great living, and then your job just banned all its employees from second job or side hustles. Your income drops like 80 to 90% per month. So many fighters got absolutely fucked over by this deal, and still are, even though Venom does the uniforms now. And what was the goal with this uniform, or fight kit as it was called? To try and make the sport look more professional. But this isn't the NBA or the MLB. You can't make a sport that involves two people giving each other brain damage for 15 minutes look more professional or family friendly like other popular sports. So they had a uniform made for the fighters, they took sponsors away from the fighters and kept all their own, by the way. Just watch any UFC event and take 3 seconds to look at the canvas. Somehow it's unprofessional for fighters to wear sponsors, but not to have literally every inch of the cage covered in any and all sponsors. Hypocrisy at its finest. But that was all the way back in 2015. What's happened recently that's watered down the product? Well, of course, being acquired by a multi-billion-dollar company will have that effect. In 2016, the Fertitta brothers, who had a majority stake in the UFC, sold it to Endeavour for $4 billion, and in 2021, Endeavour bought full control of the UFC for another $1.75 billion. When has a company like this taken over some beloved company ever produced a higher quality product at the end of the day? I can't think of one example. And since that day, the product of the UFC, meaning the fight nights, the big events, have gradually become worse and worse. I used to watch every single event, from 11 PM to 6 AM, whether it was a fight night or a big numbered event, and I loved every minute of it. These days I can barely bring myself to look at who's fighting, never mind actually sit all night and watch it. And it's not just MMA fatigue, because I can watch the PFL cards and one cards and really enjoy myself like I used to with the UFC. If you go on MMA Twitter, there's an opinion that started to form, and that opinion is that the addition of Dana White Contender Series fighters has watered down every single UFC card. If you don't know what that is, it's a mini event that's supposed to happen once a week when it's being showed anyway. It's 5 fights, it's guys and gals that are pro fighters that aren't in the UFC. Whoever wins usually gets a UFC contract. Oftentimes though, it's at the whim of Dana White, the president of the UFC, whether or not you get a contract. If he didn't like how you won, meaning you didn't knock the person out, you're going to get a development contract. That just means they give you another fight on the show, and if you don't get a good enough win again, they do the same thing, or they don't give you shit. This show started in 2017, and in that first season they brought in 16 people to the UFC. And 16 seems like a fair number. That's a pretty good amount of people, all great fighters, some hits, some misses. I wonder how many they brought in to the UFC in the most recent season. 43. 4 and 3, 43 fighters, and one of them was 17 at the time. Raul Rosas Jr. was 17 when he fought and won a contract on the show. I actually don't know how they got away with that. It must be legal to be a pro fighter at that age in the state. It was a wild thing to see a literal child fight for a UFC contract, and obviously now he's the youngest guy in the UFC at 18 years old. But the thing about this is, not all of these guys can be UFC caliber. Some of them are going to be great, most of them are going to hit a wall after 2 or 3 fights, then get cut after a couple of losses. So why would they pad their ranks with dozens and dozens of fighters that aren't going to draw eyes or attention? It's because on that show, the contract they win is only 10k show, 10k win. For anyone out the loop, that means their base pay is $10,000 simply for making weight and showing up to the fight. You only get that other $10,000 if you win the fight. Now of course there's potential for bonuses in the fight, but you can't assume that's going to happen every time. What they essentially are cheap card fillers to make their event look bigger. This tactic makes the company a lot more money because they aren't paying one person or two people 50 to 60k each every fight on the undercard, but it also makes everything less entertaining. When every card's full of people you don't know, it makes it less exciting, especially when their fights are mediocre. Who wants to see people they don't recognise in a boring fight when they're used to seeing recognisable guys that put on bangers of fights? Absolutely no one. But from the perspective of the company, the same number of people watch and they save money on pay. And now we get to what may be the most embarrassing thing the UFC has ever done as a company. The most embarrassing thing Dana White has ever backed. And if you're in the know, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. Remember a couple of years ago when your YouTube recommendations would be full of Eastern European men slapping each other, and big creators like Moist Critical would spend hours watching these competitions on Twitch and YouTube and get millions of views when they were doing it? Well, the UFC decided it would be a great idea to start a whole other fight league based on these. Slap fighting, it's called. Great timing, Dana, you only missed the trend by like 4 fucking years. And the thing that makes me and many other fans cringe is the fact that they're treating this like it's a serious combat sport. They have weigh-ins, they do interviews, all the usual shit you'd see at any pro sport, any pro combat event, but it's all for two fat guys slapping each other in the face. That's not sport, that's idiocy. A sport where two people stand across from each other and take turns slapping each other with no chance for defending anything. How exactly is that a sport? At least in combat sports you're seeing who's good at everything and who's the most skilled in offense and defense. That's what makes it exciting. You don't know who has the most skill overall, so you're excited to see the potentially insane outcome. What happens in slap fighting? Maybe somebody gets knocked out, maybe someone doesn't. That's it. I know every combat sport on the planet's basically free brain damage, but at least you can try and stop that in them. In slap fighting you just stand still and let the guy hit you. And you may be thinking, if they get knocked out, can't be that bad, it's just slapping. Well, unfortunately, you'd be wrong. When these guys get slapped, they get slapped very badly. All the person has to do that's slapping is hit them with the lower part and sturdier part of your hand. And when someone's standing perfectly still in front of you, that's an easy thing to do. It's like being punched in that way. That's why in some of these viral clips you see, when this all started, this massive farce, it looked like some of these guys were being punched in the face by Francis Ngannou. It can cause serious brain damage, and it's insane that this is allowed as a sanctioned event, and it only serves to make the UFC look worse. Whenever there's a slap event on, all the UFC social media and YouTube posts are slap content that no one wants to see. Go look at the comments on these, it's just people telling Dana and the UFC to get this bullshit off their feed, and to market their MMA fighters instead of funding this stupid wet dream of Dana White. I've muted the subject on Twitter. I've blocked some of the UFC accounts that post this shit constantly. No one follows the UFC on anything to see grown men slapping each other into unconsciousness. They follow because they want to see the best MMA fighters in the world, and as of late, the UFC has been fumbling the bag on great fighters, and I can only assume they will be in the future as well. So, what is my point in this video? If it wasn't clear, which I hope it was, it's that the UFC has become corporatised, chasing profit and image, instead of building great fighters and putting on great fights. Unless a true superstar makes their way into the UFC, you'll probably never see another one, not for years anyway. The UFC is instead pushing the company to people's eyes and minds, instead of the fighters. The only fighter recently to get a big push behind them was Paddy Turkish Teeth Pimblett, and honestly, I think he was their last attempt at making a superstar, because he could not back up the push he was receiving. He was no Conor McGregor or Ronda Rousey. It was just never going to happen with him, and now he's tanked his own popularity by being a dick anyway. He'll go down in history as the 11th hour reinforcements that never showed up, the man that had everything handed to him on a platter and he still dropped it, the man who was supposed to reinvigorate the fan base and remind us all of the days of Conor McGregor, but fail at the first hurdle. To finish off, I'll say this: everything I've discussed today is a symptom of sanitisation and corporatising, because the sanitising began before they were ever acquired by corporations. The Reebok and now Venom deals are a fix to problems that didn't exist. It made the product worse. Being bought by a corporation and having billionaire stockholders to please has made the product worse. Pushing the company over the fighters has made the product worse. Filling the ranks with cheap, mediocre fighters has made the product worse. The only way any of these things change or get better is if people stop watching. But as we all know, that will never happen, because despite the shittier product we're being handed, the UFC has never been more profitable.